To continue on our chapter 5, attacking authentication, you may download this PowerPoint presentation from our SCTA learning. And I have also provided a summary of chapter 5 handouts in PDF format. You can download this one also as well for your reference. Attacking authentication. Authentication is concept is like among the simplest of all security mechanisms, but we employed it within the web application. In a kind of typical case, the user supplies a username and a password. The application must verify that, and these items must be correct. So this is the authentication lies on the heart of application protection against malicious attacks. What are the different authentication technologies? And these are the wide range of different technologies available on web application developers and implementing the authentications for different kind of technologies. The first is the HTML form-based authentications, multi-factor mechanisms such as those combining password and physical tokens, client SSL socket secured layer certificate and smart cards or smart cards, HTTP basic and digest authentication, Windows integrated authentication using NTLM or Kerberos for Linux, and authentication services. By far the most common authentication mechanism employed by the web application uses HTML form base. So basically to capture the username and password and submit this to the application, and this kind of mechanism accounts for well over 90% of application you might likely encounter on the internet. Design, flows, and authentication mechanism. Authentication functionality is subject to more design weaknesses than any other security mechanism. It is quite common that we employed it in web application, even in apparent simple and standard model where all applications authenticates and users base or their user's name or user and password credential. But sometimes we do some shortcomings in designing. So this model can lead to a lot of vulnerability, and it will be vulnerable to unauthorized access and malicious activities. Number one is because of the many web application employs minimal control over the quality of the users, such as passwords. Maybe because a bad password be uh, very short or blank, a common dictionary or names, some set of the same username, still set of default values, and to show it an example of weak password quality rules that end users typically display a little awareness of security issues. So hence it's highly likely that an application does not enforce strong password standard. So this will contain a large number of users' account and a weak password sets. These passwords can be easily guessed by an attacker or granting them unauthorized access to the application. So we call this one as a brute force login. And it presents as an open invitation for an attacker to try and guess the username and the password. Of course, he might gain unauthorized access to the application if the application allows attackers to make repeated login attempts with different password until it's correct and one is guessed, then highly vulnerable. These are some tools that some application client side control that may have successful password guessing attacks. So pretty much like there's a hack step or hacking step that they manually submit several bot logging attempts, probably around 10 failed logins. So if you do not control any accounts, the attempts will enumerate a valid username and so on. Okay, let's move on to verbose failure messages. Like I said, verbose is not all the time its failure, but if it gives you attempt information that might lead to the attackers to use your messages, that might fall on the verbose failure messages. So, this is when the login attempt fails, and of course, um, infer that at least one piece of information was incorrect. However, that application informs you to which piece of information was invalid. You can exploit this behavior or considerably diminish the effectiveness of the login mechanism. So you don't want to give or feed information to the attackers because typically, normally, if you have given them an information, though, so many authentication mechanisms sometimes disclose this, like naming the server or naming the technology or the version and so ever. Example: a password is was supposed to be incorrect intentionally, but the verbose failure message caused because it says the password is incorrect. So literally, you're pointing to the password credential which is incorrect. Similarly to user is not registered or not recognized. So the best thing to do this is, of course, it's invalid users, right? Invalid users would be the best message that you might shown on your browser once that there will be a wrong password or username instead of saying literally your password is incorrect. So this is the kind of verbal failure messages. And later in other chapter, this verbose failure message will be useful for SQL injections. Vulnerable transmission of credentials. If an application uses an unencrypted HTTP connection to transmit login credentials, an eavesdropper who is suitably positioned on the network will, will of course be able to intercept them. Depending on the user's location, potential eavesdropper may reside. So which means because this eavesdropper is on the user's local network, this eavesdropper is within the user's IT department. It's within the user's internet service provider or ISP, or on the same backbone within ISP hosting application or within the IT department managing an application. Note, any of these locations may be occupied by unauthorized personnel but also potential for an external attacker who has compromised the relevance of infrastructure to through some other means. So even if the attacker is particularly of the network believed to be trusted, so it is safer to use secure transfer mechanism when passing sensitive data over it. Alright, so let's move on to password change functionality. And password change functionality is surprisingly, it's many web applications do not provide this for on this kind of criteria. For a user who change the password, however, this functionality is necessary for if they are well designed and authentication mechanism runs on two reasons behind it. If the password functionality periodically enforce the password to be changed, and the users who suspect that their password may have been changed compromised needs to be able to quickly change their password to reduce threat of unauthorized access. And you don't want hacker will identify your password. So If you've been compromised, change password functionality within the application should be there, or explicitly you might have been uh, go on to another step by taking a various procedure how to change your password. So nevertheless, make various requests to the password functions using invalid usernames or invalid existing password. They do mismatch the new password and confirm new password's value. So many things that a hacker could compromise a password by by guessing using a brute forcible attack. But if you're frequently changing the password, of course, this might also less the prevalence of suspicious attacks. Forgotten, forgotten password functionality. Forgotten password functionality is likewise. Uh, f- you might change the functionality of password. This kind of mechanism for recovering from a forgotten credentials, particularly in password. In this kind of situation, often we introduce a problem that may have been avoided in the main login function, such as username enumerations. So, which means if your username has been easily been identified, so in addition to this defect, design weakness in forgotten password functional frequently make this as the weakest link at which to the attackers, uh, at which to the attacks that application overall authentication logic. So several kind of design weakness can be offered. It can be found, of course. Maybe there are some questions, special questions or secret questions that will be provided to you by the application, just like this one. Remember Me functionality. In Remember Me functionality is application often implement this kind of function as a convenience way to the user to prevent them of needing re-entering their username and password at each time that they are using the application. But however, these functions are often insecure by design and leave the user exposed to the attacks both locally and by the user and the other computers. So in some Remember Me functions, it basically runs like a typical cookie. So persistent cookies that such remembered or stored temporarily or submitted to the initial application page, and the application will be trust that cookie to authenticate the user, and it creates application session for that person, basically bypassing the login. So which means an attacker can use a list of common enumerated usernames to gain full access application without any authentication. So a vulnerable Remember Me function is sometimes there, but it depends on how you use it. Anyhow, we can go back to our previous chapter. We can sanitize all temporary stored cookies, and eventually the Remember Me functionality stored from your temporary cookies will be deleted. Predictable usernames. Predictable usernames actually are basically this kind of application that normally automatically generates accounts in such a way that there will be an incremental digit or from the um, last part of the username incrementally, like for the given cost 5331, cost 5332, and so on. So when application behave like this, an attacker who can discern the sequence that very quickly arrive a potential exhaustive list for a valid username. Like I said during my class, it's kind of not like the way they want to hack once that they knew immediately your username, but they might have sent a bunch of spam mails that might most of individual users might be accepting from their respective inboxes. And it's quite annoying if you're seeing a bunch of spam mails. So You might have been thinking how they have acquired your personal email. So most likely because your company emails a predictable username. So there's an easy way the hacker uh, send those random spam mails to different receivers. Insecure distribution of credentials. Distribution is like in many applications employs a pattern in which credentials for newly created accounts are distributed to users out of bound of the normal interactions with the application. For example, via post email or via SMS or short messages or via post or email. Sometimes this is done for this reason of motivated by the security concern. For example, to provide an assurance that the postal or email address supplied by the user actually belongs to that person, so which means insecure. So we never know that that person is the one really providing that information. In some cases, also in some other forms like CAPTCHA, it's quite common nowadays. Just to know that it's a real person that filling up the form, not a robot. So sometimes what distributed is not the credential themselves, but rather an account activation. Maybe the URL which enables users to set their own initial password. If the series of these URLs sent to the successive users will manifest any kind of sequence, then the attacker can identify this by registering multiple users in close successions. Alright. Securing the authentication is quite critical in securing, given the functionality that application offers, the degree to which user will tolerate and work with different types of authentication controls. And there's also some costing for less users friendly system. And another kind of thing will be financial costs will be there. Alternatively, relationship to the revenue likely to be generated by the application of the value of the assets that it will protect. Now, this time, use strong credentials. Strong credentials is very important, of course. Strong credential meaning to say uh, you're having quite fairly accepted username and password that is suitable. You might have been reached the minimum password requirements, right? By adding some combination of both uppercase and lowercase, or a number, a special character, or the avoidance of dictionary words names. User should not be unique. That's wrong. User should be unique because basically username is considered to be also your email address. So the username is basically it's not transferable. So just like a URI or URL or a website, it's fairly unique. So any system generated by username password should be created with sufficient entropy that they cannot feasibly be sequenced or predicted. A user should be permitted to sufficient strong password. Now, let's know how to handle the credentials secretively. In many cases, all credentials should be created, stored, and transmitted in a manner that does not lead to unauthorized disclosure. And basically, all of these are very important by uh, reading those points, but subsequently, the credentials should be created in a very secured manner. Once that you created your credential, of course, you don't want to share it to anyone else. And sometimes people are still writing or jotting down in small sheet of paper and writing it on their phone as a small notepad. But of course, the most important disclosure should be avoided. Okay, validate credential properly. Of course, password should be validated in full and the application should be aggressively in defending itself for unexpected events occurring during the login processing. Alright, so far we are come to the most important part, which is how to prevent the brute force attacks. This kind of way of preventing is basically it's not 100% solution, but then we can just minimize it or just keep less activity from the side of the hackers, but keep them annoyed or stop doing what they're doing. This measure needs to be enforced within all the various challenges implemented by the authentication functionality to prevent attacks that attempt to meet those challenges using automation. Using unpredictable username and preventing their enumeration presence in significant obstacle, completely blind brute force attacks, and requires an attacker to have somehow discovered one or more specific username before mounting an attack. Of course, we wanted also to give a limit of how many times they're going to access wrong password or wrong username. And eventually it will also send a notification to the user through an email or alternative email that someone is trying to log into his own credentials. Preventive misuse of the password change functionality. The function should be accessible only from within an authentication session. There should be no facility to provide the username either explicitly or via hidden forms. Users have no legitimate needs of attempting to change other people's passwords. Okay, for the last part will be for the log monitor and notify. All authentication related events should be logged by the application, including the login, logout, password change, password reset, account suspension, and account recovery. Where applicable to both failed and successful attempts should be logged. The log should contain all relevant details such username and IP addresses, but no security secrets such as passwords. Logs should be strongly protected from unauthorized access as they are a critical source of information leakage. Now, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you to the next chapter.